Paul Barber joins us on the program. Paul, kia ora, thank you so much for your time today.
Kia ora, Andrew. Good to be here.
Now, a wonderful series that you guys are putting together as we head towards the election, talking about pressing issues. People can find out more, and I would encourage them to do so. It is homepage at the Salvation Army website, salvationarmy.org.nz. But, last week we were talking taxes and economics. This week, focusing in on the well-being of children and young people. How's it looking, Paul?
Well, one of the strongest indicators of if our country is doing well is if young people are thriving. If we can celebrate them doing well, and while there are good things happening, we certainly feel there's a lot more that needs to be done to support the well-being of children and young people in this country. So this our latest pressing issue is the briefing that's looking at what we need to do to improve the well-being by continuing to reduce child poverty, by looking after the mental well-being of young people, looking at their work and their education opportunities going forward, and also just dealing with the issues of violence towards young people.
Of course, the current government, a stated priority for them, particularly for this term, was tackling child poverty. In fact, it was a personal priority of former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Do we have a measure of how successful those policies have been? Are they making a difference?
I think you can definitely say yes, that there has been real and measurable significant progress in reducing child poverty since over the last 5 years, particularly since the legislation, the Child Poverty Reduction Act, was passed, and that has set targets. And those targets are about more than halving child poverty over the 10 years following that act being passed. And we're at the halfway point of that. And the information, the statistics we have on child poverty, they come from the year to June 2022, and they show that there have been steady declines. And that's been a result of conscious policy decisions to deliver more income proportionally into the lower income households. So we've seen significant lifts in welfare assistance. There's more than 210,000 children in the lowest income households living on welfare benefits. There's been consistent attempts to lift lower wages through lifting the minimum wage faster than those around the median. So nobody's been it's not as if people have been losing here. It's been those in the low incomes gaining a bit of ground, and that means real reductions in hardship and poverty. So that's been the good side.
That is good news, but as they say, devil's in the detail. Important to note that those statistics, that goes back to 2022. Anecdotally, what we're hearing from the community, and certainly I'm sure what your Salvation Army colleagues are seeing on the ground, is the inflation that's happening, the prices for groceries, some really negative things that have hit within the last 12 months. They're not going to show in the statistics. Perhaps things aren't quite as rosy as the last survey. Paul, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, that would be that's where it's our biggest concern. We've seen through the support services we provide, especially since late 2022, a real increase in people needing assistance, like with food, with general welfare support. So yes, however, there's also we've managed to keep the unemployment has remained relatively low, and it's interesting that wages have been rising on average again. So there's a few counterbalancing things, but yes, our message in this is the job's half done, and we want to see a plan from politicians about how they plan to continue to reduce child poverty and to get to those targets, which we all would really hope for in this country, that we see no children living in poverty.
Now, another aspect that you look at in this pressing issues report, well, yes, child poverty, that's such an important aspect of it, and good to have some good news in that regard, but also how our children, rangatahi young people, how are they doing generally? Because certainly in terms of education, in terms of mental health, in terms of having a sense of hope and purpose and engaging in careers and those sorts of things, the stats don't look as good on that side of the ledger.
Yeah, the worrying thing that is the mental health pressures on young people. We've seen a really sharp increase in the last few years of young people reporting the high levels of mental distress. And that is something that we've got to take really seriously. And it links to some of the other pressures that are on families and, and households around their the hardship and the poverty they're living with. It's around the housing, both, there's a real issue for young people being homeless, as well as the insecurity of the homes they are living in, or the poor quality. And that affects their education, that affects their safety as well. So, there are sort of a whole lot of related things going on. Again, and one of the issues that we need to think about is, firstly, what are we doing? That ambulance at the bottom of the cliff stuff. Have we got the frontline support? And that works for young people. For what works for teenagers isn't necessarily the same thing that's going to work for the older age groups. So, and there's a real issue with not enough of that kind of easily accessible community, low cost type community supports, both for mental health and just generally for young people.
Yeah.
And then there's that whole, as I say, addressing that second issue, the underlying housing, poverty, and education aspects of this.
Certainly these are all interconnected issues, but one thing that surprises me, honestly, Paul, is that this isn't more of an election issue. Particularly, as we said at the beginning, this has been a priority for the current government. This is something where they could easily demonstrate, gosh, we've got runs on the board already, vote for us and we'll finish the job. However, this isn't being talked about. A cynical person might say, well, that's because young people can't vote. But certainly, as parents, as grandparents, we want to have the best outcomes for our children and young people. We want to have a hope for a future, and we want them to have that hope as well. Are you surprised that this isn't more an election issue this time round?
Well, it's certainly disappointing. And it's something that I think it's on those of us who are the voting public to make sure it is an issue and to ask those questions. And one of the reasons we put out our pressing issues briefings is to say to those political candidates, those who want to be in office, we want to see you take child poverty seriously. And we have a current government that has a commitment to this, and ask them to say, well, how are you going to planning to fulfill that commitment? We have parties wanting to get into government. They need to show us what they're going to do to reduce poverty. And, at the moment, we haven't seen enough of those announcements that actually address what's going on for the lowest income households, the communities and the people that we're working with in the Salvation Army.
There's a little bit of rhetoric around, the problems that children create or cause. Tough on crime. Let's lock up the Ram Raiders, let's have boot camps, let's take off their phones when they're in high school, rather than actually getting to the top of that cliff and saying, what are some of the things that we can do to inject a bit of hope and tackle some of these mental health issues. There's not so much emphasis in terms of policy on preventative long-term strategies, perhaps.
I think that's a real issue. I mean, the point we make is that it's actually young people are more likely to be victims of violence and crime than they are to be the ones causing those things.
Yes.
And one of the things we really need to do is believe in our young people. There are, of course, some things that get a lot of attention, and they're really destructive and upsetting for those involved and harmful. But what we have, our young people are our future, and we really need to ask our political leaders, what are they going to do to make sure that, for instance, in the school system, around 30 to 40% of our young people identify as either Māori or Pacific, and we can see, for instance, in the health support, we don't do very well at getting mental health services that support them. Similarly, in our education system, you can see in our schools, in the schools where Te Reo Māori is the main form, the small proportion of students in schools who are in Māori medium education, as it's called, do as well as every other school student. But in the mainstream schools, where most Māori students attend, they struggle. And it gives us a message about how you need to think about what you're doing to reach the groups and the young people. We can also see with youth unemployment that it's very regional. So, and it's very located. So some parts of the country are already feeling this in the Tairāwhiti and in the far north. There's a high proportion because of the circumstances in the area. So we need to think about what works in those spaces. And that'll be different to an urban Auckland, where the majority of young people who are not in education and employment live. But we need also to understand what's going on there to be able to bring about those changes that give that hope to young people, gives them some alternatives and a sense of future.
Certainly, COVID, the disruptions of COVID being locked away, not being able to be a part of education, that will have had an impact on the current generation of teenagers and young people. But honestly, we can't use that as an excuse anymore. If children and young people don't have a pathway through education towards employment and being able to participate and thrive in society, it's not them that's failed. It's the community that surrounds them. It's not just a government thing. It's a community solution. It involves family and whānau and support networks. But it honestly looks like there's too much gaps in that support net, as there were. There's too many people falling through those gaps.
Yeah, that's the issue, and it gets quite areas where people, where the young people live, that are not well served. Their community facilities, their the health and the facilities they have available just are less.
Yeah.
The opportunities for employment, the employers to connect with may not be there. I mean, those are the things where you've got to ask, well, and put a challenge out to ourselves, and as ourselves, and thinking myself in that parent generation, that we are employers, we are people who train, we are people who live, lead and work in our communities. What are we doing? What are we asking of our politicians to reshape our communities to make them places where young people can thrive? I think that's the questions we need to ask at this election. And perhaps less emphasis on how big a tax cut you can give me, and perhaps more emphasis about what you can do for the communities that I live in.
Because honestly, middle New Zealand, the squeezed middle, as we've heard a little bit about, if given the choice between saying, hey, would you prefer a tax cut, or would you like to know that the teenagers in your family will have a hope for the future to be able to engage with society and to be able to thrive? I think everyone's going to choose option 2 in that regard. But hey, wouldn't it be great if we had some positive policies in that space? Paul, I really appreciate what you guys are doing at the Salvation Army and the parliamentary unit there. There's a lot more than we've got time to get into in terms of the pressing issue, focusing in particular this week on helping children and young people to thrive. And this is part of a series of pressing issues that you will be presenting and posting on the Salvation Army website between now and the election. Lots of food for thought, lots of things that we can take to community meetings and talk to our local MPs and politicians about. Hold their feet to the fire over this one, because it is such an important issue. Not literally, of course, don't set any politicians alight on my behalf. But hey, Paul, thank you so much for the work that you do. Thanks for your mahi. Thanks for your time today.